January 23, 1943, Guadalcanal. Rain and jungle, and a Japanese patrol crawling toward an American line. Then the forest explodes with a sound they didn't expect. Not single shots, but a relentless drum of fire. The M1 Garand, 8 rounds, one pull after another, a ping that rings like death itself. 2 men returned, 6 did not. This wasn't luck, it was industry. Springfield and Detroit turned into weapons, and that sound was the moment the balance of war quietly, forever, shifted.
January 23, 1943, Guadalcanal. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell through the canopy in sheets that turned the jungle floor into a maze of mud and rot, where every step was a negotiation with the earth itself. Along the ridgeline above the Matanikau River, Second Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched beneath a fern as wide as a man's torso and watched the American positions through field glasses fogged by his own breath. He had been trained at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in Tokyo, where instructors spoke of Bushido with the certainty of priests reciting scripture. He had been told that the Americans were soft, overfed, undisciplined, weakened by jazz music and factory conveniences. He had been told that 1 Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. He had believed it. But now, as the rain hissed through the leaves and the distant thump of artillery rolled across the island like distant thunder, Yamamoto found himself counting the number of his men who had not returned from night patrols. There were more names than he could comfortably remember. What Yamamoto did not yet understand, what none of the soldiers huddled in the green twilight of Guadalcanal's interior yet understood, was that they were fighting a war that had already been decided, not by courage or spirit, but by production lines in Springfield, Massachusetts. They were facing an enemy whose strength lay not in individual ferocity, but in the cold mathematics of industrial output. And they were about to encounter a weapon that would become, in the quiet folklore of the Pacific Theater, something close to supernatural: the M1 Garand rifle. To Japanese infantry accustomed to bolt-action Type 38 Arisakas that required manual cycling after each shot, the Garand seemed to violate the natural order of warfare itself. It fired 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. It reloaded with a single motion. It made noise like a machine, but it was wielded by a single soldier. And when it was empty, it announced itself with a metallic ping that echoed through the jungle like a bell marking the end of something sacred. The island of Guadalcanal had been Japanese since August of 1942, when construction crews began clearing jungle for an airfield that would extend Tokyo's reach across the Solomon Islands. The airfield was meant to be a dagger pointed at Australia, a staging ground for bombers that would cut Allied supply lines and secure Japan's southern defensive perimeter. But on August 7th, the 1st Marine Division came ashore in the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. They took the airfield, renamed Henderson Field, and held it through months of bombardment, starvation, and disease. By January of 1943, the Japanese High Command had committed more than 36,000 troops to retaking the island. Most of them would never leave. Yamamoto's unit, part of the 38th Infantry Division, had arrived in November. They had been told the Americans were retreating. They had been told victory was days away. Instead, they found themselves on an island where the jungle itself seemed to conspire against them, where dysentery and malaria killed more men than bullets, and where the sound of American artillery became as constant as the rain. Yamamoto had lost 13 men in his platoon since landing, 7 to disease, 4 to air attacks. 2 simply vanished during a night march, swallowed by the darkness between one footstep and the next. He did not report the desertions. There was no point. Everyone knew the war was going poorly, even if no one said it aloud. On the morning of January 23rd, Yamamoto received orders to probe the American defensive line west of the Lunga perimeter. It was not an attack, it was reconnaissance. Send men forward, draw fire, assess enemy strength. In practice, it meant sending soldiers to die so that headquarters could update their maps. Yamamoto selected 8 men, all of them veterans, all of them exhausted. They moved through the jungle in single file, stepping over roots thick as a man's thigh, ducking beneath vines that hung like nooses. The rain muffled sound. The canopy blocked the sky. There was no sense of time, only the rhythm of movement. Step, pause, listen, step. They were 50 meters from the American line when the first shot came. It was not loud. In the rain and the dense foliage, gunfire lost its crack and became something softer, almost polite. But the effect was immediate. The man in front of Yamamoto, a conscript from Osaka named Tanaka, jerked sideways as if pulled by an invisible rope. He fell into the mud without making a sound. Yamamoto dropped to his belly and tried to see where the shot had come from. There was nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement. Just the rain and the leaves and the body of Tanaka sinking slowly into the black earth. Then the firing began in earnest. It was unlike anything Yamamoto had heard. Not the methodical crack, pause, crack of bolt-action rifles, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His men scattered, some pressing themselves into the roots of trees, others crawling backward through the undergrowth. Yamamoto tried to return fire, working the bolt of his Arisaka, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round. He got off 2 shots before he realized the Americans were still firing. They had not paused to reload. They had not stopped. The sound was relentless, a drumbeat that turned the jungle into an echo chamber of violence. And beneath it all, cutting through the noise like a knife through silk, was that sound. Ping, ping, ping. The sound of empty clips ejecting from M1 Garands, bright and clear and utterly alien. Yamamoto's men began to die. Not slowly, not with the hesitant uncertainty of ambush, but with brutal efficiency. One man rose to run and was hit 3 times before he completed a single step. Another tried to aim his rifle and took a round through the jaw that removed most of his face. A third simply lay still in the mud, his back torn open by bullets that had passed through him so quickly he may not have felt them. Yamamoto screamed for his men to withdraw, but his voice was lost in the noise. He fired blindly into the jungle, working the bolt of his rifle until his hands bled, and then he turned and ran. Of the 8 men who entered the jungle that morning, 2 returned. Yamamoto was one of them. The M1 Garand was not the first semi-automatic rifle in history, nor was it the most advanced. But it was the first to be issued as standard equipment to an entire army. Designed by Canadian-American engineer John Garand and adopted by the United States military in 1936, it represented a fundamental shift in infantry doctrine. Where other nations still equipped their soldiers with bolt-action rifles that had changed little since the First World War, the United States invested in a weapon that could fire as fast as a man could aim. The advantages were not subtle. A soldier with an M1 Garand could deliver 8 rounds in the time it took a soldier with a bolt-action rifle to fire 2. He could suppress an enemy position, force heads down, create space for maneuver. He could fight at close range with the confidence of a man holding superior firepower. And because the rifle was semi-automatic, firing 1 round per trigger pull rather than in full automatic bursts, it conserved ammunition and maintained accuracy in a way that early submachine guns could not. The Japanese military had no equivalent. The Type 38 Arisaka rifle, chambered in 6.5 by 50 millimeters and adopted in 1905, was reliable and accurate, but it was a product of a different era. It required the shooter to manually operate the bolt after each shot, a process that took time and exposed the shooter to return fire. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized discipline, marksmanship, and the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier. They trained for night attacks, for close combat with bayonets, for the psychological shock of banzai charges. They did not train for sustained firefights against opponents who could maintain continuous fire without reloading. And so, when Japanese soldiers first encountered American troops armed with M1 Garands, the experience was disorienting in a way that transcended tactics. It felt, to many, like cheating. There are accounts from Japanese soldiers captured on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa that speak of the Garand with something close to superstition. One prisoner, interrogated by American intelligence officers on Bougainville in late 1943, described the rifle as the gun that never sleeps. Another, captured on Palaliu in September 1944, insisted that American riflemen carried multiple weapons because no single gun could fire so many times without stopping. A third, recovering from wounds in a field hospital on Guam, told interrogators that the ping sound, the distinctive metallic ring of an empty clip ejecting, was a trick, a deliberate noise meant to lure Japanese soldiers into the open. He believed it until the day he was repatriated. The truth was simpler and more devastating. The Americans had industrialized war in a way that Japan, despite its early victories, could not match. By early 1943, the United States was producing more than 4 million rifles per year. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms ran production lines 24 hours a day, staffed by workers who had never seen combat but whose labor determined the outcome of battles fought 8,000 miles away. Each M1 Garand that rolled off the line was a statement of industrial capacity, a declaration that the United States could afford to equip every infantryman with a weapon that other nations reserved for elite units. Japan, by contrast, produced fewer than 500,000 rifles in 1943, most of them still bolt-action. The disparity was not a matter of engineering. Japanese gunsmiths were skilled and the Arisaka was well made, but of philosophy and resources. Japan had built its military around the assumption that spiritual strength and tactical excellence could compensate for material inferiority. It was a belief that would prove fatal. Yamamoto did not return to the front line for 2 weeks. He spent the time in a field hospital, recovering from wounds he could not remember receiving. There was a gash along his left forearm, a shallow cut that had bled more than it hurt, and a bruise that covered most of his ribs where he had fallen against a tree during the retreat. The doctors told him he was lucky. He did not feel lucky. He felt like a man who had seen something he was not supposed to see, something that invalidated every lesson he had been taught. At night, in the tent where wounded soldiers lay on cots made from canvas and bamboo, he heard men whispering about the American rifle. They spoke of it with the hushed tones usually reserved for ghosts or curses. One man claimed the Americans had a weapon that fired 100 bullets without reloading. Another insisted that the rifle was fully automatic, a machine gun disguised as a rifle. A third said the Americans did not aim. They simply pointed the gun and let it fire until everything in front of them was dead. Yamamoto said nothing. He knew what he had seen. He knew the rifle was not supernatural, but he also knew that it did not matter. Supernatural or not, the result was the same. When he returned to his unit, there were new faces. Replacements had arrived from Rabaul, young conscripts who had not yet learned to recognize the sound of American artillery, who still believed the propaganda about Japanese invincibility. Yamamoto watched them and said nothing. He had become one of the silent ones, the soldiers who no longer spoke unless spoken to, who conserved their energy for the moments when survival depended on reflex rather than thought. He had stopped believing in victory. He had started believing in endurance. If he could last until the next day and the day after that, perhaps he would eventually be rotated off the island. Perhaps he would see Japan again. Perhaps. On February 9th, his unit was ordered to conduct a night assault on an American position near the mouth of the Bonegi River. It was a desperate gamble, a final attempt to disrupt American supply lines before the island was abandoned entirely. Yamamoto's platoon was part of the second wave, tasked with exploiting any breakthrough achieved by the first. They assembled in the darkness, 50 men standing in a clearing where the jungle had been burned away by naval bombardment. There was no moon. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with moisture that clung to skin and turned every breath into a labor. An officer, a captain whose name Yamamoto had never learned, gave a brief speech about duty and honor and the emperor. The men listened in silence. Then they fixed bayonets and began to move. The jungle at night was a different world. The canopy blocked what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover, turning the forest floor into a study in absolute darkness. Men moved by touch, one hand on the shoulder of the man in front, feet probing the ground for roots and holes. There was no talking. The only sounds were breathing and the soft rustle of equipment. Yamamoto counted steps, trying to maintain his sense of direction. 200 paces north, then west along the riverbank, then north again until they reached the American line. The plan was simple because there was no room for complexity. They would move as close as possible without being detected, then attack at a signal. 3 whistle blasts followed by a flare. Speed and shock were the only advantages they had. They covered half the distance without incident. Then the flares went up. They were not Japanese flares. They were American illumination rounds fired from mortars bright enough to turn night into day. Yamamoto froze, his eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden light. Around him, men stood exposed in the open, their faces pale and startled, their weapons half raised. And then the firing began. It was worse than before. The M1 Garands opened up in a coordinated volley that sounded like a single enormous weapon, a continuous roar that swept across the clearing with the indifference of a threshing machine. Men fell in groups, cut down before they could react. Yamamoto saw the soldier next to him, a boy of perhaps 19 whose name he had never learned, take a bullet through the chest that exited between his shoulder blades and continued into the man behind him. He saw another soldier lose his leg below the knee and fall forward, clutching at the stump as if he could hold the pieces together. He saw a third man simply explode, his torso torn apart by overlapping fire from multiple rifles. The light from the flares gave the scene a theatrical quality, as if they were all actors in a play about death, performing for an audience that did not exist. Yamamoto ran. He did not decide to run. His body made the decision without consulting his mind. He turned and sprinted back the way he had come, his rifle forgotten, his equipment slapping against his sides. Behind him, the firing continued. He heard men screaming, some in pain, others simply screaming because they had lost the ability to do anything else. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed in the mud and lay there gasping like a fish on dry land. He waited for the bullet that would end it. It did not come. By dawn, fewer than a dozen men from his platoon had returned. The captain was not among them. Neither were the replacements from Rabaul. Yamamoto sat with the survivors in a dugout carved into the side of a hill and listened to the sound of American aircraft overhead. They flew in formation, unchallenged, their engines a steady drone that seemed to mock the very idea of Japanese air superiority. One of the soldiers, a sergeant named Ito, spoke quietly about surrendering. He said it without shame, as if he were discussing the weather. He said the war was already lost, that everyone knew it, that continuing to fight was pointless. The other men said nothing, but no one disagreed. Yamamoto thought about the rifle. He thought about the way it had fired without stopping, the way it had turned men into corpses with the efficiency of a factory process. He thought about the sound it made when it was empty, that bright metallic ping that seemed to celebrate its own lethality. And he realized, sitting in the mud beneath the sound of American bombers, that the rifle was not just a weapon, it was a symbol. It represented something that Japan, for all its talk of spirit and honor, could not match: abundance. The Americans did not need to conserve ammunition. They did not need to make each shot count. They could afford to fire freely, to suppress, to overwhelm. They could afford to lose battles and still win the war, because behind every soldier was a nation that could produce more rifles, more bullets, more everything. Japan had Bushido. America had factories. And in the algebra of modern war, factories mattered more. The evacuation of Guadalcanal began on February 1st and concluded on February 7, 1943. Over 10,000 Japanese soldiers were withdrawn under cover of darkness, evacuated by destroyers that risked American air attack to reach the island. Another 25,000 did not leave. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Others simply vanished into the jungle, their bodies consumed by the island's relentless ecology. Yamamoto was among the evacuees. He boarded a destroyer on the night of February 5th, along with 60 other survivors from his regiment. They stood on the deck in silence as the island receded into darkness, watching the fires that still burned along the coast where American artillery had struck supply dumps. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The M1 Garand would go on to serve in every major theater of World War II. It fought in North Africa, where American infantry used it to clear German positions at Kasserine Pass and El Guitar. It fought in Italy, where soldiers climbed mountains with Garands slung across their backs and used them to dislodge defenders from hilltop villages. It fought in France, where paratroopers dropped into Normandy with Garands strapped to their legs and used them to hold hedgerows against German counterattacks. And it fought across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, in battles where the sheer volume of fire it produced became a decisive factor. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not exaggerating. For Japanese soldiers, the Garand became a symbol of a larger truth they could not escape. They were fighting a war they could not win. It was not a matter of courage. Japanese infantry fought with a ferocity that Allied soldiers remembered for the rest of their lives. They launched banzai charges into machine gun fire knowing they would die. They held positions until they were overrun, refusing to surrender. They starved on islands cut off from supply, eating roots and grass, and still they fought. But courage, in the end, was not enough. The United States produced 16 million rifles during World War II. Japan produced fewer than 3 million. The United States manufactured 6 million tons of artillery shells. Japan managed barely 700,000. The disparity extended to every category: ships, aircraft, trucks, radios, medical supplies, food. The Americans ate K-rations that Japanese soldiers would have considered feasts. The Americans called in air support with handheld radios, while Japanese units relied on runners who often never arrived. The Americans had penicillin. The Japanese had prayers. Yamamoto survived the war. He was transferred to the Philippines in mid-1943, then to Burma in early 1944. He fought in battles whose names he forgot, retreats that blurred into each other, withdrawals that were called strategic repositioning, but everyone knew were simply running away. He was wounded twice more, once by shrapnel, once by a bullet that passed through his shoulder and missed the bone by centimeters. He lost weight until he no longer recognized himself in mirrors. He watched men die of starvation, of disease, of wounds that would have been survivable if there had been proper medical care. And through it all, he carried his Type 38 Arisaka, working the bolt after each shot, knowing that somewhere on the other side of the battlefield, American soldiers were firing their Garands without pause. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Yamamoto was in a camp in Manchuria, waiting to be sent south for what everyone assumed would be the final battle for the Japanese home islands. The announcement came over the radio. The emperor's voice was thin and distant, distorted by static, but the message was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. Men sat in silence, unsure how to react. Some wept, others stared at nothing. Yamamoto felt only relief. He was alive. That was enough. He returned to Japan in the autumn of 1946, repatriated through a processing center in Yokohama where he was deloused, interrogated, and given a set of civilian clothes that hung on his frame like a scarecrow's rags. He traveled to his family's home in Nagano Prefecture, a village in the mountains where the war had been a distant rumor. His parents were dead, his father from a stroke, his mother from grief, or so his sister told him. His younger brother had been killed on Okinawa. The house was smaller than he remembered. The fields were overgrown. Everything seemed diminished, as if the war had drained color from the world. He did not talk about what he had seen. No one asked. In post-war Japan, silence was easier than memory. The country rebuilt itself with the same efficiency it had once applied to war, constructing factories and schools and cities from the ruins of firebombing. American occupation forces distributed food and medicine, rebuilt infrastructure, imposed a new constitution. The transformation was swift and disorienting. Within a few years, Japan was making radios and cameras, exporting goods to the same countries it had fought. The war became history, filed away in textbooks and memorials, acknowledged but not discussed. Yamamoto lived quietly. He married a woman from a neighboring village, a widow whose husband had died in China. They had 2 children. He worked as a school teacher, instructing children in mathematics and history, subjects that seemed blessedly free of ideology. He did not speak of the war to his students. When they asked, and they rarely did, he told them only that it had been difficult and that they should be grateful to live in peace. He believed it. Peace, he had learned, was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of abundance. It was enough food to eat, enough warmth to sleep without shivering, enough time to watch children grow. It was the luxury of thinking about the future rather than simply surviving the present. In the evenings, when his family slept, Yamamoto sometimes thought about the rifle. He remembered the sound it made, that relentless drumbeat that had haunted his nightmares for years. He remembered the ping of empty clips ejecting, bright and clear, a sound that announced death with almost cheerful efficiency. And he realized that the rifle, for all its lethality, had not been the real enemy. The real enemy had been the system that produced it. The factories, the workers, the supply chains, the industrial capacity that could arm millions of men with superior weapons and still have resources left over for everything else. Japan had fought that system with slogans about spirit and sacrifice. It had been a mismatch so profound that it bordered on farce. The M1 Garand was retired from active American service in the 1960s, replaced by the M14 and later the M16. Many were sold as surplus, purchased by civilian shooters who valued their reliability and historical significance. Some were given to allied nations as military aid. A few ended up in museums, displayed behind glass alongside other artifacts of a war that had reshaped the world. But for the men who carried them, and for the men who faced them, the Garand remained something more than a machine. It was a distillation of a particular moment in history, when industrial might and democratic values converged to produce a weapon that was both brutally effective and strangely egalitarian. Any man could fire it. Any soldier could master it. It required no special skill, no aristocratic lineage, no spiritual purity. It simply worked. And that, in the end, was what won the war. Yamamoto died in 1983 at the age of 64 from complications related to tuberculosis he had contracted during the war. His family buried him in a cemetery overlooking the mountains he had known as a child, beneath a stone marker that listed his name and dates but made no mention of his service. His children found, among his possessions, a single photograph from the war, a faded image of young men in uniforms, standing in front of a jungle backdrop, smiling with the uncertain optimism of soldiers who have not yet seen combat. Yamamoto is in the second row, his face smooth and unlined, his eyes clear. He looks like a stranger. His daughter kept the photograph in a drawer, unsure what to do with it, unwilling to throw it away. It remained there, forgotten, until the drawer itself was discarded years later during a move. The lessons of the Garand, the importance of industrial capacity, the value of equipping ordinary soldiers with superior tools, the reality that wars are won by logistics as much as by courage, became foundational to modern military thinking. Nations that had relied on bolt-action rifles in World War II rushed to adopt semi-automatic and automatic weapons in the decades that followed. The Soviet Union developed the SKS and later the AK-47. NATO countries standardized around semi-automatic battle rifles. China, emerging from civil war, designed its own copies of Soviet weapons. The age of the bolt-action rifle ended, not because it was ineffective, but because it was obsolete, rendered irrelevant by a new standard of firepower that the M1 Garand had established. But the rifle's deeper legacy was not technical, it was philosophical. The Garand embodied a democratic approach to warfare, one that trusted ordinary citizens to wield extraordinary power. It was the rifle of factory workers and farmers, of immigrants and first-generation Americans, of men who had never fired a gun before being drafted and who became, through training and necessity, soldiers capable of defeating professional armies. It was a weapon that said, in its design and its deployment, that courage and discipline mattered less than systems and resources. It was a weapon that turned war into a problem of production rather than a test of spirit. And in doing so, it helped to win a war that might otherwise have dragged on for years longer, claiming millions more lives. The rain eventually stopped on Guadalcanal. The jungle reclaimed the battlefields, covering trenches and foxholes with vines and moss, swallowing shell casings and spent clips into the black earth. The airfield that had been fought over with such desperation became a civilian airport, servicing small planes that carried tourists and cargo between the Solomon Islands. The rivers ran clear again. The only evidence of the war was the occasional piece of rusted metal turned up by a farmer's plow, or the bones that erosion sometimes exposed along the ridgelines where men had died over ground that no longer seemed worth the cost. And somewhere in that soil, buried beneath decades of growth, were the echoes of a sound that had once meant death. The bright, metallic ping of an empty clip ejecting from an M1 Garand. It was the sound of abundance, of industrial might, of a nation that could afford to wage war without counting bullets. It was the sound that Japanese soldiers had mistaken for a trick, a lie, something impossible. It was the sound of the future, arriving on a jungle island where the past still believed in the supremacy of spirit over steel. And it was the sound that, more than any speech or slogan, announced the outcome of a war that had already been decided in the factories of Massachusetts and the assembly lines of Detroit, long before the first shot was ever fired.